Welcome to my messy studio, everyone. My name is Mark, and I'm an artist, an art professor, and a fountain pen addict. And in this video, we're going to compare two popular pens, the Lamy Safari and the Pilot Kakuno, to see which one is better for drawing. While both of these are on many top 10 lists of inexpensive pens, I have to admit that they're new to me. But since I'm often asked to give my opinion on them, I figured it was time to fill in that major gap in my pen knowledge and get both. And since these pens are similarly priced and have similar features, I thought it would be fun to do a pen battle. I think sometimes pen reviews, particularly when dealing with pens with rather conventional properties, can be repetitive. So doing pen battles like this introduces a touch of excitement into the process. Plus, sometimes the best way to talk about a pen is to compare it to another pen. Let's get started by talking about the Pilot Kakuno. Here's the Pilot Kakuno in a funky clear neon green. This pen is about $15 here in the US and is very light and made of thin, rather cheap-feeling plastic. While it doesn't have a clip, it does have a faceted shape with this little roll stop right here, making sure that it won't roll away. The snap-off cap features an inner lining which does a good job keeping the nib wet. The cap also posts securely without off-balancing the pen. While the grip section is nice and long, providing you with ample room to grip, it has two flattened sides, something that I really dislike because it forces you to grip the pen in a certain way. It's not a giant issue, but still an irritating one. I don't need a pen company telling me where to hold my pen. I can make that decision for myself. Thank you very much. The pen is a cartridge converter, which uses the very nice proprietary Pilot cartridges that hold a lot of ink, I believe 1.1 milliliters. The pen is also large enough to accommodate the very nice Con 70 converter, though the fit seems quite loose. Unfortunately, the all-plastic barrel has two holes on the bottom, so if you want to eyedropper it, you'll have to use a bit of silicone glue to seal these holes off. Being a cartridge converter, the pen is quite easy to clean, usually requiring nothing but a flush with one of these rubber bulbs. Furthermore, the nib and feet on the Kakuno pull right out for a deeper cleaning. Just make sure that you rotate the nib back to the correct alignment with the grip section, otherwise the nib will not be aligned with the grip. Let's see how the nib performs in my proprietary series of tests. I'm working on my usual Strathmore Bristol paper and have filled the pen with my usual testing ink, Noodler's Lexington Gray. This pen features a steel fine nib, and in the consistency test, it puts down an unbroken line in every direction and at every speed. This is why I adore Pilot pens and have so many of them. From the cheapest $5 Pilot Mini to the $300 Pilot 823, every Pilot just works, which is why I so often use them in my recorded demos, when I can't have a pen causing me problems halfway through. In the flex test, true to Pilot steel nibs, this pen has very little flexibility, going from an extra fine line to something approaching a fine medium. This for me is actually a decent amount of line variation for a non-flex pen, and the reason why I like drawing with fountain pens so much, since just about any pen can put down line variation with a little bit of pressure. And when you flip the pen upside down, it can put down an even thinner line, great for those tiny little details. So in the flex department, this pen rates at about a 1.5 on my 1 through 10 flex scale. Not entirely stiff, but not quite in the soft nib territory, which starts at about a 2.5. In the feedback test, the pen is nicely smooth for such a fine nib. I find that Pilot steel nibs have slightly more feedback than their gold nibs. Why this is the case, I'm not sure, since smoothness has nothing to do with the nature of the material being used in the nib. And actually, if I want the same degree of smoothness, I can polish this nib with a 12,000 grit micro mesh. And lastly, in the wetness test, the Kakuno puts down a moderately dry line, something to be expected in a non-flex pen. This type of flow is ideal for a variety of purposes, for working on cheaper papers, and for drawing techniques that require a lot of layers of hatching. Now let's take a look at our other combatant, the Lamy Safari. This is an inexpensive all-plastic pen, which in the US usually retails for just under $30. That's twice the cost of the Pilot, and I think it's reflected in the slightly more robust build quality. I say slightly because really we're dealing with the same cheap-feeling plastic here, only one that's a bit thicker. The pen actually shares many of the same attributes as the Kakuno, both in its pluses and its minuses. Like the Kakuno, the pen features a snap-on cap with an inner seal that prevents the nib from drying out. Also like the Kakuno, it posts securely and doesn't off-balance the pen. And again, like the Kakuno, the grip section is nice and long and without those annoying threads that sometimes can irritate the fingers. The bad thing is, like the Kakuno, it has two facets cut into the grip section, forcing you to hold the pen in a certain way. Is this because both these pens are intended for students? I don't know, but I'm a bit too long in the tooth to be told how a pen should be held. This pen is also a cartridge converter that uses proprietary Lamy cartridges, which are nice and hold about the same amount of ink as the Pilot cartridges, or you can use this converter, which you often have to buy separately. Like the Kakuno, the Safari can easily be flushed with one of these rubber bulbs, or for deeper cleaning, the nib does slide out. But while I've seen images taken by people who have managed to pull out the feed here, the operation requires pliers and considerable force, which leads me to conclude that it's not designed to be removed. That does make the pen harder to clean, something to consider if you plan to use it with waterproof inks. Now let's take the pen through my test to see how it performs. True to my standards, I filled it with Noodler's Lexington Gray, and I'm working on Strathmore Bristol paper. In the consistency test, the pen performed well, putting down lines at every speed and direction without skipping. By the way, though this pen is labeled as an extra fine, the line here is about the same width, if not slightly wider than the one made by the Kakuno. That's no surprise, since Japanese nibs tend to run finer than their Western counterparts. But I think it's time for the fountain pen industry to get its act together and standardize the nib sizes, and label them in fractions of a millimeter instead of relative terms like fine, medium, and broad. In the flex test, this pen was visibly more flexible than the Kakuno, going from an extra fine line to a full medium. This is a pleasant discovery for a non-flex pen, since I do love my line variation. In reverse writing, it performed well, but I can't say the line was any thinner than in normal writing. So, in my flex rating, I think this pen deserves a 2, or even slightly beyond that, a 2.15. This is a pen that's starting to approach a soft nib, something like some of the Pilot soft nibs that I enjoy so much. In the feedback test is where I encountered problems, with the pen being quite scratchy. This was surprising, since some of the other Lamy pens I've tried were fairly smooth. I looked at the pen under a loupe and the tines were aligned, and if there was some kind of fault with the nib, it would not have performed so well in the consistency test. So I'm going to assume that the pen performs as intended. But if that hasn't been your experience with the Safari, please let me know. And in the wetness test, the pen performs similarly to the Kakuno, but perhaps a touch wetter when the pen was flexed, which makes sense since the lines are wider. All in all, other than the scratchiness, which can easily be remedied with a little polishing, the pen performed just fine. So, what are the results of this battle? Is there a clear victor? Let's do the final tests with both of them by doing a drawing, and as I work, I'll give you my decision. Here I'm switching papers and working in my favorite sketchbook made by Talens, their Art Creations series. In terms of ergonomics, I would give the edge to the Kakuno. While both pens have similarly annoying authoritarian grip sections, the facets on the Kakuno are more rounded and therefore less pronounced. While they'll still force you to hold the pen in a certain way, they're not constantly prodding you to do so, whereas the Lamy never lets you forget what pen you're holding. In terms of durability, the Lamy is clearly the more durable option, but this is just my assumption since I've only owned these pens for less than a month. However, both are inexpensive, cheaply built pens, and I don't think it's reasonable to expect decades and decades of use from them. In terms of ink capacity and converters, I think it's pretty much a tie. Both pens use large proprietary cartridges and come with fairly decent converters. In ease of cleaning, the Kakuno is a clear winner. If you change your inks often or use waterproof ink, you need a pen that completely comes apart for deep cleaning. Everything on the Kakuno does so, whereas on the Safari, only the nib is removable. So if you have a fully clogged ink channel, you're going to be out of luck. And finally, in overall nib performance, I give the slight edge to the Pilot Kakuno. The feedback on the Lamy more than canceled out whatever advantage it had in terms of line variation. I should note that the Lamy performed much better in my sketchbook than in my tests, which goes to show you how much paper plays a part in a pen's performance. But even on better paper, the feedback on the Lamy was less than pleasant. While I often mention that I, as a frequent user of dip pens, am not particularly bothered by feedback, this only applies to pens that have very fine tips. In such situations, scratchiness is something you have to accept. The nib on the Lamy is not particularly thin, and there's no reason why I should have this much feedback. On the other hand, the nib on the Kakuno is much smoother, though not as smooth as Pilot's superb gold nibs, but acceptably so, gliding comfortably across the page. So, taking everything into consideration, I'm going to award this win to the Kakuno. It's the more comfortable pen, it's easier to clean, and it has a smoother nib. That said, there are a number of Pilot pens that use this exact nib, and I would pay a little more to get the excellent Pilot Pereira instead, which is a small pen with a much more robust build quality and more comfortable grip section. I hope you found my comparison of the Pilot Kakuno and the Lamy Safari useful and diverting. And if you did, please subscribe to my channel and stay tuned to more pen battles like it. Thanks so much for watching, and hope to see you back in my messy studio very soon. Bye-bye.